Okay, works for me. Thanks so much for joining, everybody, and welcome. We're really excited for such a cool webinar tonight, and really appreciative of everyone who took time out of their Wednesday. It's Wednesday, right? Out of their Wednesday to come join us. Time is so weird now. Before we get started, I wanted to first start out with just a quick recognition of just briefly some of the times we're in, and I wanted to say something quick about George Floyd, who in Minneapolis 2 days ago was a 45-year-old Black man who was pinned to the ground by a white police officer for a non-violent charge. And he was repeatedly saying, "I cannot breathe," until he eventually stopped speaking or moving and was pronounced dead when he was taken to the hospital. The 4 officers on the scene were fired for the incident, and though we need no reminder, those, of course, are the same words that Eric Gardner said before he was killed in Staten Island, what's now 6 years ago. And yesterday, police in Minneapolis fired tear gas and rubber-coated bullets at protesters, applying some organized state force against those who were crying out for justice in the midst of the killing. And this is a theme that this report we're going to talk about tonight discusses a bit, and I imagine Laura may touch on. So I just wanted to take 30 seconds at the start for just some silent reflection, just to remember that while we fight militarism and violence, that applies at home as well as abroad. Okay, thanks everybody. Okay, so now quick intros. My name's Nick. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Mass Peace Action, Peace and Climate Working Group, and also an organizer with the Sunrise Movement in our Boston hub. So for those of you who don't know, the Sunrise Movement is a youth-led movement organizing young people across the country to stop climate change and advocate for passing a Green New Deal, to begin a just transition to secure a future for everybody. And Mass Peace Action is an organization dedicated to working on issues of militarism and peace, which is a hugely intersectional issue, perhaps as much as climate change, that spans many working groups throughout the organization. And ours specifically is the Peace and Climate Working Group. And we are dedicated to the mission of making and broadcasting the deep connections between peace and climate issues, and working alongside the broader movement to win justice and work together cooperatively. This webinar tonight is one in a series that the Peace and Climate Working Group has been having. Recently, we had one on April 7th called Coronavirus Capitalism and How to Beat It, A Path Forward. And on April 13th, we had one called The True Cost of the Military-Industrial Complex, Connections Between the Military, Climate Change, and the Coronavirus Pandemic. We'll link those were recorded and are on YouTube. We'll link those at the end of the discussion. Okay, so that is, well, actually, Paul, would you like to introduce yourself very quickly?
Well, I'm Paul Shannon. I'm with American Friends Service Committee, and I'm a member of the Mass Peace Action, Peace and Climate Working Group. And I think if we have time at the end this evening, we can talk about some of the projects we're looking at. So it's great to have everybody who's tuned into this.
For sure. Thanks, Paul. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Laura, who is our fantastic guest tonight. So Laura Steichen is the outreach coordinator for the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. In this role, Laura produces research and analysis on the intersections of militarism and the climate crisis, and supports movement building focused on shifting our war economy to address the climate crisis. Prior to the Institute for Policy Studies, Laura worked as an organizer, researcher, and writer for the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. And I will kick it over to Laura.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate that introduction. And thanks to Massachusetts Peace Action for hosting this webinar, and a big thanks to everyone who's joining us this evening. I think it should be a really enriching conversation. So thanks to everyone for participating. As Nick said, my name is Laura Steichen, and I work for the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. And at the National Priorities Project, we conduct research and produce analysis on the federal budget and on military spending. And so, as probably everybody that's on this webinar already knows, the US military claims a huge percentage of the discretionary budget that Congress allocates every year, while programs that are critical to actually meeting people's needs and keeping people safe. I'm thinking about programs that we might use to manage a global pandemic or to address the climate crisis, for example, get pennies by comparison. So as Nick said, in my role at MPP, I'm really focused on producing research and analysis to draw out some of the many intersections between climate and militarism, and support movement building across both movements. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a presentation for you all. Okay, it should be working. Definitely let me know if it's not. Looks good?
Looks
okay,
good.
Great. So just so everyone knows, I'll just say right off the bat, my slides, or the slides for this presentation, will be made available to everyone who participates in this webinar, and also some of the relevant links of the documents and resources that we talk about. So those will be sent to everyone that registered for the webinar afterwards. So you can look forward to receiving that. So today I'd like to share the findings of a new report from the National Priorities Project that we released this year on Earth Day. It's called No Warming, No War: How Militarism Fuels the Climate Crisis and Vice Versa. In this report, we lay out the ways that militarism and the climate crisis intersect and are mutually reinforcing, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So climate change and militarism intersect in a variety of alarming ways. Many of these are been brought up and worked on by the working group that's hosting this webinar, and I'll go through them in my presentation. The first one is that the Pentagon is a major polluter and contributes significantly to the climate crisis. The second one is that the United States has a well-known history of fighting wars for oil, and the fossil fuel industry also relies on militarization to uphold its operations around the globe. Next is that climate change and border militarization are inextricably linked. Overinvestment in the military comes at the high cost of underinvesting in other needs, including climate action. The next one is that workers in both the military and fossil fuel sectors need a way out. We need a just transition for workers and communities in both sectors. And finally, what's evident across all of these findings is that racism and racial oppression form the foundation for the fossil-fueled and militarized economies, and neither could exist without the presumption that some human lives are worth more than others. So that last one, I really want us to just ground in this conversation and think about throughout the key findings that we'll go through. So I'm sorry if this framework is a little bit hard to read for folks. It's one of the things that we'll be sure to share in the follow-up materials. But I'd really like to frame our discussion today within the context of the just transition framework that many are probably already familiar with. This was developed by a group called Movement Generation and is very popular in the climate justice movement. The just transition is a process of transforming an unjust, extractive economy that exploits and harms people and the planet. That's the economy we have now, to a just, regenerative economy with healthy, thriving communities and ecosystems. That's the living economy that we really need. And again, it might be kind of hard to see, but militarism is really the coercive arm of the extractive economy. It's there on the bottom under the extractive economy, and militarism is really what governs the extractive economy. People have always resisted the exploitation of the extractive economy. It's built on business models that are in opposition to healthy human life. But violence and the threat of violence are really what keep this economic system in operation. And as we'll talk about today, this plays out on a global scale. The military yields such power globally. Militarized violent policing employ brute force against communities within the United States, and immigration enforcement violently patrol national borders, sort of at the nexus of the international and the domestic. So the first point we make in the report is that the Pentagon is a major polluter. The US military, as probably everybody listening knows, has extensive infrastructure both domestically and abroad. And so it probably doesn't come as a huge surprise that the largest industrial military in the history of the world is also among the biggest polluters. The US military produces about as much greenhouse gases in any given year as some entire industrialized countries do. For example, about the same amount of emissions as countries like Denmark and Sweden produce in a year. The Pentagon is the world's largest institutional user of petroleum. Just one of the military's jets, the B-52 Stratofortress, I knew I was going to make that mistake. The Stratofortress consumes about as much fuel in 1 hour as the average car driver uses in 7 years. So if you have a car that you use to get around, the amount of fuel that you produce in 7 years is the equivalent that the Stratofortress produces in 1 hour. Next, the United States has a really well-known history of fighting wars for oil. Oil is the leading cause of interstate war and accounts for roughly half of all interstate wars in recent decades. A pretty significant part of the hundreds of billions of dollars spent on the Pentagon every year goes towards defending the world's oil supplies. Research suggests that the military spends at least $81 billion every year defending the world's oil supplies. And what that really means is just sort of code for protecting oil supplies globally from other countries and ensuring access for the United States. The fossil fuel industry also relies on militarization, like I said before when we were looking at the just transition framework, to uphold its operations around the globe. So this results not only in wars, but also in militarized responses to resistance. So all over the world, those who fight to protect their land from extractive industries are met with state and paramilitary violence. We also know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are disproportionately targeted by this militarized violence. At least 3 people are killed every week around the world for defending their land and water. And Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by this violence. While Indigenous people make up about 5% of the global population, they account for about a quarter of those murdered for defending their land and the environment. And we see this play out right here in the United States, for example, with militarized responses to indigenous-led pipeline protests. And these populations that are fighting against the exploitation of extractive industries like the fossil fuel industry are increasingly characterized as eco-terrorists, sometimes just straight up terrorists. And so we see the language used to justify war and military aggression abroad used to target those who resist the domination and the exploitation of the fossil fuel economy. It's also worth noting that local police forces acquire military-grade equipment through a Department of Defense program called the 1033 program that gives riot gear, weaponized vehicles, and other military equipment to local police forces. Next is that climate change and border militarization are inextricably linked. So we know that climate change is already compounding existing conflicts and instabilities and causing more conflict and more political instability. And the result of this is that we will see unprecedented numbers of dislocated people. Estimates project that around 200 million people will be displaced by the middle of the century due to the impacts of climate change. And some estimates project even higher levels of displacement and migration, sometimes as high as 1 billion is predicted by 2050. And we already see this happening. Between 2008 and 2015, an average of 21 million people were displaced annually from the impacts and threats of climate-related hazards. So we're already seeing this play out, and particularly people in the global south are already experiencing these impacts. So many of us are probably aware of climate migration, but we don't necessarily hear the federal government talking about this too often. But the Pentagon has actually been planning for climate migration for decades. In a 2003 report, for example, the Pentagon describes the fortressing of America to prevent what the report describes as, quote, unwanted starving immigrants, unquote, from the global south from entering the United States. So we see pretty overtly xenophobic language employed by the Pentagon in reference to people who are displaced by the climate crisis. And what we see is that around the globe, governments are tending not to respond to this growing problem with solidarity and with sharing of resources, but actually governments are allocating more of their budgets, not just the United States, but governments around the world, to build walls, to hire armed guards, and to militarize borders to keep migrants out. In the United States, the US Border and Immigration Enforcement has undergone pretty unprecedented escalations, military escalations in particular, since that last report I just referenced was published. You know, the border has been described as by some as an imagined war zone, and a bloated border budget, militarized border budget, funds increasing numbers of armed border patrol agents and surveillance technologies, including drones. Customs and Border Protection has the largest US drone fleet of any kind outside of the US Department of Defense, including Predator B drones that were built for military use, but that CBP has been using since 2006. These drones are incredibly costly. They run around $17 million each, and they cost $32,000 every single time they're used to apprehend an individual. I think something that I really want to make sure that we're thinking about as we talk about border militarization, especially as it relates to the southern border of the United States, is that the US is responsible for more greenhouse gas pollution than any other country since the Industrial Revolution. And so having played such a significant role in causing the climate crisis, the United States bears a disproportionate share of the responsibility to address it. And a part of that is a debt to displaced people around the world who predominantly have done relatively little to contribute to the climate crisis. So next I want to talk about the budget and military spending. I think anyone who works on climate knows that proposals to meaningfully address the climate crisis, which will require a significant level of public investment, are often characterized as unrealistic pipe dreams, right? Like we all know this tired refrain of, that sounds great, but how are you going to pay for it, right? But we also know that this same scrutiny is almost never applied to military spending. And the reality is there is no shortage of funds or resources to fund a just transition to the green economy. We're now spending over $700 billion every year on the military. The military budget in 2020 was 272 times larger than the federal budget for energy efficiency and renewable energy. We also know that the Pentagon, the military budget, is a huge portion of the discretionary budget, but when we expand that to encompass all forms of militarized spending, which includes immigration enforcement, which includes incarceration, things of this nature, we're adding tens of billions of dollars in spending on top of the traditional military spending every year. So compared to the $6.4 trillion that we've spent on war in the past 2 decades, the cost of shifting the US power grid to 100% renewable energy is estimated to cost about $4.5 trillion over 10 years. So what's really clear from this trade-off is that instead of spending trillions of dollars on war for the past 2 decades, we could have already transformed our entire energy grid to be 100% renewable and had literally trillions of dollars left over. As the federal government increases military spending, they also prop up the power and influence of military corporations, which then use their influence and power to help draft policies that further their own profits. Nearly half of the military budget goes to contractors every year, and these contracts are incredibly lucrative. The CEOs of the top 5 contractors are paid a combined over $100 million per year. And we see a very similar situation panning out in the fossil fuel industry, where fossil fuel executives are making huge sums of money off of a business model that is literally destroying human life. The same goes for border security. A lot of the same corporations that have defense contracts are involved in border security and immigrant incarceration. And these corporations are making millions of dollars in profits to monitor, arrest, incarcerate, and deport people. So there's a lot of trade-offs for not only military spending, but just the budget priorities that we have that really don't align with the values that we want to put forth. We know that enforcing fair taxes on the wealthy, corporations, and Wall Street could yield $866 billion per year, which could be redistributed to other priorities. Ending direct and indirect subsidies for coal, oil, and gas could amount to another $649 billion. And we could redirect at minimum, $350 billion from the Pentagon's current spending per year to achieve true security, end wars, reduce our aggressive posture overseas, rein in military contracts that are draining the public coffer for private gain, and actually increase our security as a nation. I think something that I think about a lot is that these enormous and just really unnecessary military expenditures have really warped our sense of what's possible and have tricked a lot of us into believing that we can't afford to improve our lives or keep the planet livable. But that's not the case, and the Pentagon is monopolizing a lot of the money that we need to meaningfully address the climate crisis. Finally, I want us to think about jobs. So that's a really important part of this puzzle. The military and the fossil fuel industry, they mirror each other in that workers frequently end up funneled into the lethal work of both sectors due to limited options. And workers need a way out, workers need a just transition. Like fossil fuel workers will need to transition into new jobs, there must be alternative pathways to good employment for individuals and communities whose livelihoods are tied to the military. Sometimes in the anti-militarism movements, this is talked about as the conversion movement. In the climate justice space, it's talked about more often as a just transition, but it's sort of a similar concept, and it's really critical in all of our conversations about changing paradigms that we consider the necessity to provide alternative pathways to good employment. Right now, the United States military is functioning as essentially the only major federal jobs program in the United States. But funding the green economy, for example, instead of military jobs, would actually be a net job creator. For the same level of spending, clean energy and infrastructure create over 40% more jobs, and energy efficiency retrofits create nearly twice the level of job creation. When we look at jobs in the care economy, things like teachers and social workers, those create even a higher level of job creation for the same amount of spending. And those are also important jobs to consider when we talk about the just transition, because we need that kind of care infrastructure, and those are also very low carbon jobs. So starting to wrap up this portion of the presentation, in solidarity with the movement on the front lines of US militarism and climate injustice around the world, I want to conclude with some principles for collective action that can help inform our cross-movement organizing. All human life has equal value. Economies are only as healthy as people and the planet. All people have a right to self-determination. There is enough for everybody. We are all interconnected, and so are our movements. So with these principles for collective action in mind, we must pursue solutions to the climate crisis that are also at the same time challenging the violent and oppressive systems that have fueled both war and global warming for generations. What's next? I think we'll probably talk a little bit about this in the next portion of the presentation, but there's a lot of ways that we can start to organize around some of the issues that I've talked about in this presentation today. Right off the bat, if you visit nationalpriorities.org, you can download this report. I think the link might also be in the chat for folks. But we also have resources for advocates that break down some of the components and some of the intersections into smaller portions as well. So there is the Climate and Militarism report, and there's also some other resources for organizers, including a discussion guide. I want to encourage folks to just start off by hosting, right now it probably needs to be a virtual discussion on the intersections of climate change and militarism. We have a discussion guide up on our website. If you're working on in an anti-militarism space, I think a good next step is to find a climate justice organization that you can start to link up with, and vice versa. And I also want to encourage folks to write your local newspapers and start to sort of introduce some of this framing around other ways that we could be resourcing, or excuse me, other ways we could be allocating our resources that would actually keep our communities safe. Thanks. Wow, that was a whirlwind of information. Like I said, to download the report and for more information about the work that National Priorities Project does, you can visit our website. And please feel free to get in touch with me. There is my email, lorah@ips-dc.org. Please feel free to get in touch with me if you want to talk about movement building, or if you have ideas on how we could build on this work.
Wow.
Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Laura. was amazing. Yeah, we so appreciate you running us through that. And yeah, someone just said in the chat something along the lines of, wow, those are so many great statistics and facts and resources for us all.
Yeah, I know, I'm sorry, that was a lot. I kind of, I get into I black out and go into presentation mode. But we can break it down a little bit in the discussion, yeah.
Sure, yeah, we love that type of thing, so no worries at all. That's what we live for. So I think now we're gonna transition into a sort of Q&A discussion section. And for this part, I think we'd really encourage folks to use the, since we're on a webinar, to use the Q&A feature because it's very helpful to facilitate these types of questions that come in. So for the folks who don't know, if you kind of are looking at your Zoom window, you look right at the bottom, there's like a Q&A button that has two little conversation bubbles. If you click that button, you will be able to post a question and we'll see it. And others, I think, can upvote them, like click the little thumbs up to say, yes, this is a great question. And then we'll start to parse through some of those and field them to Laura. So I suppose while you all are doing that, Paul and I came up with some questions to sort of kick it off while people are getting their brains going. Paul, do you want to start with anything?
Well, I think, Laura, your report was written just before the pandemic hit full force here. And I guess what I'm wondering is just ask a question about your own thinking about how these ideas can be brought into the discussion of where the country goes from here. In a post-pandemic period, if we ever do get to a post-pandemic period.
Don't say that, Paul. I hope we do.
Yeah, how the information here can help guide us, especially given the onslaught we're going to get from the Trump administration about the only important thing is putting people back to work, and to do that we have to remove all regulations about climate that get in the way of industries putting people back to work, and that whole thing that is going to really hit us very, very hard at some point in this process. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are of where people are concerned about this information, how it might be able to be used to move us in a different direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there is a lot there. I think, first of all, this moment that we're in right now has really demonstrated how Washington's militaristic budget priorities have really left our country very unprepared for a crisis. And we see that we're in for a lot more crises, maybe not the same as the one that we're experiencing now, but we know that in a climate change future, we will have more crises, we will have more disasters. This is what Naomi Klein has described as serial shocks. And we see that we're really not prepared to address these types of crises. And so I think that provides the opportunity for policy interventions that do provide an infrastructure of care and a social safety net for the types of shocks that we're in for in a climate change future. So I think that's one point. I think that it illustrates some of what's to come with the climate crisis. And if we sort of see this crisis as a dress rehearsal for the climate crisis and the many shocks to our system that are to come, we can see that we're really unprepared and that we need to put a sort of very different infrastructure in place. I think your point about jobs is also really important. Some of the bad news of the lots of bad news that we're seeing right now is that we've seen hundreds of thousands of jobs in the clean energy sector have been lost. And so we're going to need some type of jobs program. We're definitely going to need a significant level of public investment to put people back to work. And so there's definitely an opportunity for organizers to ensure that the types of jobs that we're creating are clean energy jobs, care economy jobs, sort of mobilizing on a lot of the asks from groups like Sunrise that Nick is involved with, that have been talking about related to public investment and job creation associated with the Green New Deal. So I think there's, it's a good opportunity to, continue to organize around what a lot of climate justice groups have been talking about for years. But is maybe the necessity of it and the urgency of it is perhaps more visible to many than it has been. I think that those are a couple points, but I'll stop and you can follow up.
Well, thank you. That's great. Really important things to think about there. Let's see what we have here in questions. Nick, why don't you make a comment first? Let me sort through these a little bit.
Sure, yeah. Well, I've been keeping a bit of an eye on them. One that caught my eye that one of our other working groups works on. It's kind of related. This is from, oops, you left my screen. Oh, this is from Martha Nathan. What do you think about the recommendation to fund a Green New Deal by eliminating US nuclear weapons?
I mean, I certainly think that that part of funding the Green New Deal can and should come from defunding the military, and that would include nuclear weapons programs. So I think that, there's sort of been a missed opportunity at times. I know that it's not always the strategic objective to talk explicitly about how we're going to fund a Green New Deal. I know that that's a strategic choice, but I think sometimes there is also a strategic advantage to being able to point to the significant amount of resources that are currently in the military. And we've seen there's been some mobilization from progressive policymakers during the COVID crisis to redirect military funding to address the current public health crisis. So we have seen some leadership there, more so than there has been at other times. So that's promising.
Okay. Question about, are there some specific weapon systems that are especially fruitful to organize around? Or are there specific concrete proposals for cutting the military budget that are out there and seem to have some possibility of being accomplished?
Sure. Well, I would say I'm not the best person to answer the question about specific weapon systems. I actually suspect some of you all probably could speak to that better than I could. So feel free to jump in when I'm done if you have ideas for that. And certainly everyone here should feel free to contribute to these questions. In terms of specific proposals for cutting the military budget, last year, the National Priorities Project put out a moral budget with the Poor People's Campaign. And we came up with $350 billion that could be cut from the military annually. And I'll put the link to that moral budget in the chat. But in that report, we do lay out very specific cuts that could be made from the military to fund some of the other priorities that are put forth in the moral budget.
Okay. I think I know the answer to this, but we have a question here. If you look at Social Security and Medicare annual costs are 4 to 5 times the total military budget, would you take from those budgets too? This is an important question because it kind of constantly mixes up sources of funding for different parts of the budget. So if you can clarify that for some people, that might be helpful.
Yeah, so when we talk about the military budget, that is a part of the discretionary budget, and that's the budget that Congress allocates every year. So there's actually a lot more opportunities for shifts in that budget, because that is something that Congress allocates every year, compared to the name of the budget that the Social Security and Medicaid is coming out of is escaping me currently, but that's a totally different pot of money. And I would say we would not suggest cutting healthcare in order to fund the climate crisis. We would say that we actually need to fund universal healthcare as a part of addressing the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm.
There's one that got a lot of thumbs ups. This one's from Rosalie. Are there particular ways in which we can fruitfully connect the need to work internationally, for example, on the issue of all the climate refugees, with the need to rely much less on military solutions to international disputes? How can we sell these non-military solutions to the public?
Yeah, great question. I think what this question is really bringing up, that I'm really glad that was brought up, is that in this moment, particularly with addressing the COVID crisis, but also in the face of the climate crisis, we need international cooperation. We need international sharing of resources. We don't need an adversarial militaristic approach to international relationships. We need global cooperation and sharing. And so I think a part of that is really looking beyond a militaristic understanding of national security, and actually, instead of investing in militarism, we need to invest in international cooperation in order to develop global solutions to global problems. Something that I would like to direct people to is there's increasing levels of advocacy and public scholarship around having a global Green New Deal. And I think if we look at something like the intersections of climate and militarism, the urgency and necessity of having a global Green New Deal, globalized climate solutions is pretty apparent. Our partners that we work with at National Priorities Project at the LEAP just started a new project dedicated to a global Green New Deal. And there's other groups that have been working on this for a while. I know a couple good resources that I'll share in the follow-up materials. Happy to get more specific. I know that's very general, so let me know if there's other specifics to that question.
So, Laura, what do you think the main obstacle is in folks working on climate to see the importance of working on militarism at the same time, and that the two are intricately linked? Because while things are changing, at least according to our experience, I think here in the Boston area, there is a real wall that seems to exist between most of the climate movement and the issue of US foreign policy, military spending, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think using the just transition framework is a really powerful way to identify the way that movements are interconnected, because it really draws out the economic systems and the structures that are the root of a lot of the crises that we're facing right now, and that are sort of the underlying target of a lot of movements. And so I think sometimes in the climate space, we're really focused on fighting the fossil fuel industry, which is obviously so important, so necessary. But the fossil fuel industry isn't like an isolated situation. It's a part of a broader extractive economic system. And that's the same economic system that's bringing us militarism. So I think if we can sort of get down to the underlying structures that are, you know, bringing us to these multiple crises, there's the sort of opportunities for collaboration and intersection are a little bit more obvious. So I know that's that's really zooming out, which maybe isn't a super satisfying answer, but I think that's like a really critical place to start, and really needs to inform like specific strategies for what that type of collaboration looks like.
We have a question here from Ken. Won't our adversary nations use as an opportunity any reduction of US military spending? This is actually something that's touched on in the report. So how would you answer that question, Laura?
Yeah, so is the question sort of like, are we going to be unsafe if we cut the military?
Yeah.
That's sort of, okay.
Yeah, in other words, won't our adversaries take advantage of cutting our military budget? Got
it. Well, I think something that's critical to pointing out is that the US military budget as is ginormous compared to every other military budget around the world. The latest numbers just came out, and the United States military has this is what is the numbers? There's more money spent on the U.S. military than the next 10 countries combined. So that's pretty telling, just how huge our military investments are. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is just challenging the sort of underlying assumption of the question that military spending is what's keeping us safe. One thing that we've noticed is that sort of at the same time when the latest numbers came out that identified that the United States military budget is the largest in the world by a huge margin, that was the same week that, or around the same time anyways, that the United States exceeded all other countries in coronavirus deaths. And so if you look at sort of those comparisons, you can see that military spending isn't necessarily keeping people safe. And we really need to challenge this notion that we need to fund the military in order to be safe, when funding the military is preventing us from investing in programs that we need to meet people's basic human needs and keep us safe in general, regardless of the climate crisis, but especially in light of the climate crisis.
Here's another good question. Thank you, Laura. That relates to some part of your report. Is there any possibility of using U.S. civilian military humanitarian response to use military resources for humanitarian purposes?
We should absolutely reallocate the military budget and the huge amount of resources that have gone into the military to for humanitarian purposes. For example, a lot of the resources that the military has right now can be used to address the pandemic that we're facing. So I definitely think that we should do that. I'm a little bit more careful and cautious about looking at actually repurposing the military to do humanitarian work. I would challenge the idea that the military is the best suited to do humanitarian work. And also just the military is very skilled at finding ways to receive more funding and not necessarily having, being accountable to the supposed need for that funding. So I would be very concerned about using the military itself as an institution to meet humanitarian
just
objectives.
Following up on that, Laura, could you just go into how the military does look at climate change?
Yeah.
And what its strategic preparations are?
Great question. And I guess this is a major part of the report, but I didn't touch on too much in my presentation. You may be shocked, there's a lot more in the report than I went through today. So the United States military has been talking about climate change for decades, which I think I talked about a little bit today. But the military isn't doing so because it's interested in resolving the climate crisis or in addressing the root causes of the climate crisis. The military is mostly concerned about the ways that climate change will impact military operations. And so we see that climate change is actually used to justify more military spending so that the military can, for example, have more resources to respond to climate migration, not in a humanitarian way, but in a way where it militarizes borders to prevent migrants from seeking refuge in the United States, things of that nature. We lay out sort of within the report more clearly than I'll be able to articulate off the top of my head right now, but sort of all the ways that the U.S. military is addressing climate change, but not trying to fight it, just trying to boost itself up in light of these new climate threats, which are predominantly people from the global south as it perceives.
Thank you.
And maybe, Laura, we could end on this one.
Sure.
So this is kind of mixing in for I guess me and any young people in the audience. There's like a lot of like DoD funding that goes into STEM, in particular, like in universities for research and basically financing like grad student careers and young academic careers and stuff like that in like a really pervasive way.
Yeah.
And so part of the question is, like, are there strategies where like the broader coalition of climate groups could try to, redirect this type of attitude? And also that like, in our group, we think a lot about, well, we've been trying to think about, we say a lot of the necessary and depressing but necessary facts about things, but how do we sway people with a more positive view of like what a world of peace could look like in a world of climate justice?
Yeah. I'll start with the second part of that question. I think that one of the beautiful things about the climate justice movement and what people who've been organizing on the front lines of the climate justice movement for decades have put forth is that more than probably any other movement, well, maybe that's not the case, but more than some movements, the climate justice movement really puts forth this vision for what our future could look like. And the ways that addressing climate change, the ways that we can just build a fundamentally better, more equitable, more healthy, thriving, living world in the process of fighting climate change. There's just some really beautiful writing that's out there that sort of illustrates what our future could look like with a Green New Deal that's better than it is now in a lot of ways and more equitable. So I think we have a lot, the climate justice movement, especially that's been around for decades by people on the front lines of injustice, really offers a lot of alternative visions for our future that are just very uplifting in spite of, very tragic circumstances that we're facing otherwise. So I think that's one aspect of it, and that's definitely something to take away from the climate justice movement. Remind me what the first part of your question was.
Just sort of aimed at some of the institutionalization of like DoD spending and research and part of the military industrial complex.
Yeah, I think strategically, really looking at the military budget and dissecting it is sort of an important first step. There's just, people know that we have a big military, but people don't really know what it means and where the money is going. And I think helping people just identify the massive amount of investment in the military and just pointing out some of those sort of peculiar investments that people might not otherwise associate with the military is a good first step. I know something that we did this year, when we looked at the budget, the presidential budget proposal, is we were looking at the Department of Energy, which receives a fraction of the military budget. But if you start to really look at the budget documents for the Department of Energy, it's very clear that like a huge percentage of the Department of Energy is actually military spending. And I think identifying that for folks, most people have like no idea what's in a federal budget or where money's going. And so I think there's some, rhetorical and strategic opportunities to point that out and then pivot to, and we could move those resources and have these things that are better. I think it actually can be a somewhat clean message for folks.
Sure. Well, I think we'll wrap there because I think we're saying we'll end at 8. So one more time, thank you so much, Laura. This was incredible. And we will, so I'm about to paste a lot of things in the chat. Let's see, did this work? Okay, so before we end, go ahead, Paul.
Just want to say quickly to thank everyone for tuning in to our webinar. And I'd like to really emphasize that as we try to figure out how to move forward, given this confusing and awful situation we're in, that this report is well worth reading. It's got not only a lot of information, but it has a lot of ideas that are going to be very important to us as we move into the future and deal with the upcoming election and the battle for which direction our country is going to go in. And so I would just recommend that. Also, Nick is putting information about various climate change groups in the greater Boston area that are really, really important. Encourage everyone to link up with those groups, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, who's done incredible stuff. I think, have you put that link up there, Nick, of how to get involved with them? There's, of course, 350 Mass, and then, of course, there's Sunrise for younger folks. And they're waving the banner of the Green New Deal. So there are groups out there that are really doing exciting things, and we want to encourage everyone, if you're not already involved in these groups, to get involved with them. We'd like to invite you to our discussion group, our working group on peace and climate change. Nick is putting Rosalie Anders' email address in the chats. We will also include it when we send out a response to all of you, probably tomorrow. And you're certainly welcome to join us. Our next meeting is June 11th. It's a Thursday at 7 o'clock. It'll be a webinar. It'll be a Zoom meeting, of course, as opposed to being in person, unfortunately. So we'd invite you to that. Our group is trying to work on this issue of this post-pandemic thrust that we need, and how to mobilize around new openings that perhaps exist for us because of the pandemic, and questions that it started to raise for people along the lines that Laura was talking about. So we'd certainly welcome you to join us. We've had a couple of older webinars on these topics, and we hope you might get a chance to view them. They're on YouTube, and you have some links to those too.
I'll also just say, thanks to everyone for joining, and thanks to Massachusetts Peace Action for hosting and for inviting me. I also want to make a plug for some of these local groups that are just sort of coming together or are working for the first time. I know that's not the case for you all, but maybe some people that are tuning in on organizing around climate and militarism. There are some national groups that have been doing this work for a long time and have really compelling models for what organizing around climate and militarism might look like. One of them is Global Grassroots Justice Alliance. Another one is the Red Nation, which put out really great work on the red deal, they call it, that explicitly calls out defunding the military and its sort of paradigm for funding climate solutions. So I'll point to some of those other groups that I just want to make sure are acknowledged for the work that they've done, that have a lot to offer folks in some of the follow-up materials I'll share. But you all are doing great work, and I appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with you.
Great.
Thank you, Laura.
Well, thank you again so much, Laura. And thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.